Welcome to my presentation. My name is Bank. I'm one of the founders of a small but ambitious Hungarian development team, the White Gentleman, and the creator, writer and creative leader of Chicken Police Painted Red. Chicken Police is an animal noir adventure game, which will be our lab rat for today's experiment. So, our theme today is colorful world building in black and white, creating the illusion of life in a narrative-driven game like Chicken Police. Which is a really fancy and quite confusing name for a talk, really. But honestly, giving names has always been very difficult to me, but also very important, because I think naming something is always a huge responsibility. I have always believed that names have some sort of magical power, if that makes sense. They have this weight, purpose, cause and meaning in them, which we must respect as creators in basically any kind of media. Not just naming of a character, for example, but even a place or an event, anything basically. A name dropped at the very best moment can change whole stories very drastically. And this was an essential tool I happily used while creating Chicken Police, when I wanted to condense the individual and shared history of this living, breathing world into a relatively short game and a simple system. And we will talk in part about this, amongst other things today, how this spark of an idea has become a whole world that goes beyond the game itself, and how this massive wealth of information accumulated over the years has been able to incorporate cleverly and seamlessly into the game's narrative structure, and overall into the game's soul, so to speak. But first of all, what is Chicken Police exactly? Well, it's quite hard to put it into words, so the best if I ask you to look at the game's one of the game's trailers first and get a little idea of what's this all about. So here we go.
Have you ever been with a predator before?
Well, small case. We'll wrap it up in no time.
What kind of case?
The kind of case where if you come with me right now, you're not on duty anymore.
What a pleasant surprise. The roaster copper's in person.
Cluckin hell. Get yourself together, bird. Hey, is that how you greet two old friends?
Hey, I'm not joking, Sonny. I got a shotgun under the bar.
Whatever happens, never fall in love with that woman.
That's exactly what I was thinking. You see, what the hell could have happened here?
The last clucking color left this city years ago. And slowly I'll turn gray, too.
Not even you can see the world as that black and white.
The 9 o'clock show. With a glass of cheap bourbon. And the red gown. With the silent music. Every day the same.
Please, don't be scared. I'm just really excited.
It's dead.
So, yeah, this is the game. It looks way more silly than it is, and that's the point actually. This contrast we built with the usage of a silly name, a silly premise, and this weird and unique art style a dead serious world and the complex and deeply crafted characters, so this contrast was the main purpose, really. But in itself, it's not enough to carry a game, so we had to build a world around it, around this strange premise and contrast between the art style and the silliness of the game, but also with the gritty, mature themes. So the question is how and why we did what we did. So why we choose this art style, why we went with black and white, why animals, but most importantly, what we learned from this journey as a game developer and as a narrative designer. The idea of Chicken Police is 10 years old now. The whole thing started in 2011 when I started to work on a comic book idea with the same name and with the same premise. And then it became a script for a short animation, then I wrote some short stories, I published in Hungary, then I turned to the video games as a genre because I was a huge nerd in my entire life, and my life dream was always to one day I will make video games and I will be a developer. So when we came up with the idea that we will make this a video game and make this a reality and started to build a team around this, it was decided in about the first few months that we were going to make the game 100% black and white, with some little exceptions, but we will speak about that later. And this was one of the first things we decided as a team, and this was super important, not just in an art style perspective, but also in a narrative designer perspective. Why we did this? One reason for this is clear and obvious, and this is film noir. This was the main inspiration, especially the classic noir movies of the 40s and the 50s like The Big Sleep, Casablanca, Gilda, The Third Man, Touch of Evil, Murder My Sweet or Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, or I can go on. But, and this is a huge but, that just wasn't enough for us. We wanted to make this black and white approach a part of the world, or at least a part of our protagonist's world, and a huge important piece of the narrative too. So not just some flashy gimmick or something like that to be different than others with this black and white approach. To understand this more, let's check out a little piece from one of our cutscenes of the game, and then we will talk about this more detail.
I ran out to get a pack of cigarettes, but I left my wallet at home. Yeah, that's me. I'm getting old. My name is Sonny Featherland, an investigator for 20 years, and once the star of the predatory division of the Clawville Police Department, one half of the legendary Chicken Police. But buying a pack of smokes is more than I can handle right now. Maybe I should just lay low. Yeah, I'll do that. The most colorful place in the wilderness. For all the gods, what bullshit. The last clucking color left this city years ago. And slowly I'll turn gray too. Still, what do I expect? We're living in a vast experiment, and don't even notice that everything got clucked up a long time ago.
So, as you saw and heard, we used the lack of color as a concept, as a message, as a metaphor to show our hero's Sonny Featherland's mental state, so to speak. That's how he sees the world around him, as a cold, colorless place, which is obviously because he became cold and colorless himself too. And the fact that the city of Cloville is called the most colorful place in the wilderness was a great tool for us to use this contrast between the idea of this world, this false utopia, and the world that lives in the mind of our hero Sonny. And that was basically the cornerstone of the idea of the game's narrative structure, that our hero's mental state will be the lens throughout we saw the entire game as a player. And for this we try to achieve the maximum amount of immersion possible. For example, our notebook is an actual notebook we see as Sonny sees it. The same with our inventory system and our interrogation sections. Basically, the whole game is presented in this first person perspective, outside the regular conversations, which is all for the sake of the best immersion possible in a fairly classic adventure game. But, and this also an important but, it's hard to create the maximum amount of immersion in an adventure game where you can't move freely in a 3D environment. So if you want to achieve this greater kind of immersion, you need a world which is believable, even if it's a weird fantastical place like our world, like Cloville, because if you could create a world working perfectly in its own set of rules, you were victorious in making the best achievable immersion you could. But the most critical question was for us, how will we achieve this? Because our tools, in a gameplay perspective, was relatively simple. And this is how we get to our second act finally, and the things are getting more and more interesting. So, make them clucking real. Yeah. Usually, people who prefer deep immersion in any kind of video game tend to get mad and confused when a certain gameplay element pulls them out of this immersion, which is completely understandable. But for me, it was always at least as annoying when a character acted or spoke unrealistically or out of his character in the context of his own world. So that was the main thing I wanted to make right first when I started to work on the dialogues or the story as a whole. But if I want to be honest, basically every genre of games is guilty in this constant immersion breaking. We could give examples of RPGs, adventure games, RTSs, open world exploration games, really any genre. And some are more guilty than others, but that's not the point now. For me, one of the primary goals was to create characters who are not only interesting or funny or just dramatic and lovable, but real, with full capital letters. Within their own world, they need to have a past, a future, and a present too, but mostly goals, drives, and motivations. Basically, a life outside their game. So, in my opinion, in any kind of world building or story creating, one of the most important things is to give the characters a real purpose and motivation, not just in the context of the game. It was one of the most essential elements for me when I started to shape the key characters, and it takes almost just few minutes to think about the character's driving force outside its basic character traits. But it could completely transform the way you put words into the character's mouth from then on. You will start understanding your characters much more than before. And for this I created, or still, a kind of formula which helped me to be able to see and interpret otherwise extremely complex character traits in a super primitive system. With this formula, I have broken down the primary emotions, or more like drives, of the characters into three main factors. This method is somewhat similar to the way criminals are usually profiled. Of course, that's a much more complicated process in criminal psychology, but as a core concept, it's more or less the same, which is great because a criminal psychology concept and methods resonate very well with a gritty noir detective story we were creating. So basically, I distinguished three main drives, as I said: motivator, stressor, and goal, or ultimate goal. I won't go into details too much because we don't have the time, but put it simply, with the motivator, I define the core concepts that drive our character, what he wants to achieve in life, what drives him: reputation, love, hate, revenge, some kind of enlightenment. So basically, what's the core drive which is get him out of the bed every day? And then I found the stressor of the character, which gives you what pushes our character out of his comfort zone, what can annoy him, harass him, or even shake him. A delicate topic from the past, for example, mentioning a certain name to trample on his vanity. So what's the main negative factor of his personality, to put it simple? And the third and final one is the ultimate goal in the context of the game, so which gives us exactly what drives our character in the context of our story we're creating, what the character drifts towards when what he wants to achieve, obtain, or even avoid when we met him or her in the story. So with these three fairly simple factors, we are able to give all of our characters a skeleton. But even for a little few sentence side character, like our snarky bartender horse, for example, who has nothing to do with the main storyline, this way got a deeper story, even a history around its fairly simple character. And if we cleverly connect him with other characters built with this method, we get their shared history, and this way we got this huge map of connections with all the different kinds of little, sometimes laughably tiny, insignificant side stories that will start to slowly make our game a living, breathing, complex system. And for this I use a tool now that was made specifically to simplify these complex relationship systems, which is a great help, but you can just use pen and paper for this, and it helps a lot to make real and believable characters in your world. And now that we mentioned the shared history, we got to my favorite part, Act 3, hidden history. As I mentioned in the previous sections, the past is very important in building a world, obviously, but just as important, or perhaps even more important, is the relationship between two specific characters you want to tell the story with. Chicken Police serves as a good example of both, as in the story we mention several historical concepts, people and events that could have been, of course, just sprinkled names without any real background or purpose, but that usually falls down quickly and became obvious that it's just BS and there's no real substance behind it. So we started to outline a history spanning centuries, because I usually find it extremely confusing, and I became mad when I don't know the causes and starting points of a word concept in any video game or anything, basically. So that was some kind of personal focus for me to create this 100 years worth of history for our game. But that's not a new thing, that's not what I created. One of my favorite examples for this, and one of my most defining experiences as a game developer and as a player, was the original Thief series. Because when you think about it, a stealthy fantasy FPS doesn't necessarily need a world that is deepened or realized in a way that the first three Thief games were. Because it could have been enough if they just give this unique environment, a basic story, and a goal for the main character, and the game would have worked even then very well. But Thief and the Looking Glass Studios ventured much further in this territory. They did the same thing later with System Shock 2, and later Bioshock did the same thing with simple diary entries, letters, books, posters, wall-written messages, even audio diaries, or sometimes overheard spoken dialogues. They provided so much and so deep background information about the world that it subconsciously and inevitably created a strong image in the player of where they are, without having to sit through any long tiresome exposure, monologues or cutscenes or whatever. So with these basically secondary or indirect ways of telling little stories and using basic world building concepts, you can create coherent and believable worlds, no matter how crazy your world core concept is. So animals or city under the sea, anything could work if you make these little tiny details right and use them right, obviously. So that's how and why I started to work out the world of Chicken Police and the city of Clawville, and this was what motivated me to create this sprawling history going back hundreds of years around it, which the player could then discover from himself nicely at its own pace. But also we do not oblige the player to do so. We don't even build these into the main story thread or the main storyline, but let the player discover it themselves if they have the motivation, the time and the curiosity for it and the eyes for it. But it's not just the history of the world that is important regarding the overall world building aspect of the game, but the characters' own common history with each other, which I alluded to in previous sections. For example, Chicken Police begins at the end of a career, a life path, and a friendship. Our protagonist, Sonny Featherland, is tired, burned out, half alcoholic, has left his family, has left all the motivations and hope in life, and has to pull out half a year in peace until his retirement from the police force. But because he's at basically the end of his story, when the players met him, he needs to have already established history with the world and the characters around him. Basic thing is we don't want to play this amnesia card, which could be working well in some cases and works very well in some cases, but we don't want to use this card and introduce the player to the world in such a cliché fashion. So we had to be very careful in giving the information to the player they need, yet we had to make it look natural from the point of view of the main character as well, because in our game the player is the main character, obviously, but in a very immersive way. And that's the real balancing act, I think. But if you get it right, that could work like a charm and could be super cool for the player to experience. So in other words, while the player drifts into the world as a newcomer, Sonny has lived a life there, and has to introduce the player to its own reality in a way that it's not burdensome, but still seems natural. And from the game designer and narrative designer point of view, this was one of the most challenging tasks, but one of the most fun tasks to do. So basically sprinkling these little bits of the past so that the player doesn't feel left out of something, but instead starting to be a part of something that has a rich and real history, with finding these little pieces scattered around the world. And I think in a narrative heavy game, this is best achieved by understanding the connection between the two characters and play with it. In our story, for example, Marty McChicken, Sonny's former partner, isn't talking to us in the beginning of the story, isn't talking to Sonny, because there was some serious incident between the two of their past. We don't know exactly what it was, and this is a very important aspect of their relationship, because it is a constantly present question for the player and thus adds an exciting dynamics to the relationships between the two characters. It adds a new layer to their relationship. To put it slightly spoilery and simplistic way, Sonny persuades his old partner Marty to work together again, who has been waiting for this opportunity, but not because he missed his partner, the grumpy old cock, but because he basically wanted to see his fall. He wanted to be there when this legend created around Sonny is collapsing. And this is also felt by the player, but as the story progresses and we learn how much they have gone through the years, slowly, along with Marty, the player also realizes that they have an unbreakable bond, almost a destiny together, so to speak, and they simply cannot exist without each other. And this strange yet very lovable chemistry between the two main characters pushes the whole story towards the end point, basically.
Oh, well, look who's here. Hello, boss bird. What, are you lost? This is the PD building, you know?
Cut the shit, Marty. We're better than this.
Well, at least you are. Better than anyone, huh?
Marty, come on, let's forget that. What's past is past.
Easy for you to say, Sonny.
Damn it, Marty, you shot me, remember? I almost bled to death.
Hell yeah, I remember. Unfortunately, my aim wasn't good enough.
I need your help, okay? That's what you want to hear.
Well, it's a start.
Okay, I've said it. I won't do it again.
Yeah, right.
So, are you in? Just for tonight. Small case. We'll wrap it up in no time.
What kind of case?
Yeah. So, as you saw, this was a very small, simple fragment from their interactions, yet we constantly felt that chemistry between them. And for this, I used the classic buddy cop formula to outline their relationship, which is of course a cliche, but the cliche can be a perfect starting point as it is familiar to the player. It provides a basis on which the player feels comfortable, but here comes the very important but again. This familiar relationship has been given this noirish, bittersweet, dramatic tone with this incident in their past that will make the dynamics of the two quite unique and their chemistry work very well. So basically we grabbed the cliche and slapped it in the face quite hard to work well within the context of the story. And this is an awesome tool to grab something the players are familiar with, so yeah, a cliche maybe, and then make it a little bit strange, a little bit weird, a little bit unique, with some kind of twists, and that could work like magic sometimes. And the strongest weapon to achieve this kind of feel was to this kind of chemistry between two characters was to create their common story, their shared history. So their background, basically, which the player will never experience firsthand because the player never saw the actual happenings. But the dialogues and the interactions between the two characters will perfectly draw these nevertheless, and it will keep the player curious all the time. And in a narrative and even a detective game, what could be more important than keeping the player constantly curious? One of our favorite add-ons that reflects the slightly distorted reality of the shared story of our characters is these 10 books we hidden in the game that retells the adventures of Sonny and Marty, the Chicken Police, from the perspective of the author of the books, Meredith H. Marble. The author itself is a mystery for the player because our heroes will speak about her several times and we see her works, but we never met her in person, which gives this whole book series and the author itself this mist of mystery. These were great little tools in the game which are completely missable, but these also enriches the world and the shared past of Sonny and Marty significantly, because with these the legend of Chicken Police gets its foundation. We understand that it's not just floating above the game's fictional world, but it has to come from somewhere. And here comes this little spell, which is certainly has a real name, but I just call the Fog of Beliefs, and which is the method to giving the player only tiny hints and tiny pieces of certain things, but never spoon-fed it to them, leaving the player to shape its own personal reality of it, which will be entirely unique. If you build your world around the mystery, yet craft it deeply and thoughtfully, every player will live the experience the same, but also every player will have a very different interpretation of the same story and characters in their heads. So, if a little confusing and foggy what I'm saying, it's because it's very hard to summarize such a complex topic in 45 minutes. But overall, the point is that I considered the small personal stories and relationships of the characters to be far more important than the actual story of the game or the complexity of the crime, for example, that our heroes have to expose. This too was inspired by the tradition of good noir movies, where crime itself was never the focus, as in a Poirot or Columbo or Sherlock Holmes stories, but the characters involved in the crime was the most important things. Their drama, their motivations, and most of all this fragile and complex web of their relationships. And for Chicken Police, this was the case 100%. For example, at some point in our game, we met this not so kind crow lady character, Olivia, who is an assistant to one of our suspects. And at first we don't necessarily understand why she's so distant and brittle, but very soon it turns out that Marty, one of our heroes, once dated the lady, then forgot to call her back. And there was a little spike left in her because of this, so this gives us super little basic tiny conflict, and we will immediately feel a little chemistry, a little connection between the two characters, one of which we just met in this very moment. And this tiny little insignificant detail of a character is more than enough for the player to feel that the character is real and that she has basically his own life outside the game's main story. Then, of course, it soon turns out that it was just Marty's vanity, and the lady has long forgotten about it, and she didn't care about Marty at all, or that he's never called her back. So, but that only made the strange little relationship between them even spicier and more relatable, more real. And Olivia, our crow lady, is not even a main character in the game at all, yet she has its own little reality, just like everyone else in the game, which made her whole rounded character and worked very well in its own world and own set of rules.
Look, Olivia, you know, last time...
Please, Marty, there's no need.
Yes, there is. I know I wasn't a gentleman, and I know I should have called you, but I was young and...
You don't have to explain. I wasn't waiting long for your call. I forgot about it fast.
That's good to hear, I suppose.
And this is our final act, sadly. Slowly but surely we're getting the end of the presentation, and if I have to sum it up, all I wanted to talk about, and I'm sorry if I was a little fussy, is that we need to be able to define the ultimate knowledge of good world building and good character creating. And I think the point of the whole thing is for the player to feel the world. Did the player believe that the world exists even outside the game when they don't play it? And also for the characters, did the player believe their story continues even when the game is over? If the answer to these questions is yes, then I think you have done your job perfectly, because after the player finishes the game, he will feel some kind of void in itself, and this void is exactly what we are looking for. This is the summertime sadness, so to speak. We want to create and take advantage of this void because this can make your game stand out from the rest or even go beyond video games as a whole, no matter what kind of game you are making on or what genre is it in. If once the player are done with your game and still wants to continue it, they want to know even more about it and see what happened to their favorite characters and want to be there in the world you created, your job is done here. And if you get this feedback, that's the highest praise you will ever need as a writer or a narrative designer, and yeah, your job is done here and you did your job great. So this was the main aim for us and for me when I designed the narrative structure of the game and the story of the game and the characters of the game. So since our time is really short, I would like to thank you for listening to my rather flamboyant presentation, and I hope that based on my own example I have managed to plant some ideas in you, or just give confirmation of what you already knew. Either way, it's great and I am happy. Thanks again for your presence and of course for the opportunity to be here. It's a real honor. And now you can come to our little Q&A session with me, where you could ask me anything about anything and I will try to answer the best of my ability. But thanks again and take care.
The most colorful place in the wilderness. For all the gods, what bullshit.
So, what now?
Back to Clawville, where we can finally put all the pieces together.
Hey, don't you try pecking me, chicken, or I'll bite out your throat.
Maybe one day you'll experience it, Sonny. Have you ever been with a predator before?
Sonny boy, what have you gotten yourself into again?
She's got the most influential gangster of the city wrapped around her finger. She calls him her little furball. How dangerous do you think she is?
But that's when those bastards arrived. And the even worse bastards.
Don't play innocent with me, Santino. You both stink like you're in deep, deep shit.
I like this new Sonny.
There is no new Sonny. Just the old ones had enough.
Oh, you are a funny guy.
Well, I've been called worse.
Okay, thank you, Bálint, for a superb speech about your game, about narrative design, and we are about to start our Q&A session. I will be happy to see your questions in the chat, and we are waiting for some questions, but I have one from me. And how did you manage to avoid overusing clichés? Because you say you required it to establish some moments in your story and in your about your characters, but it's always very easy to spoil everything because you start using it everywhere.
Yeah, actually, it's one of the most hard balancing act. Creating the story if you use some cliches as cornerstones of your narrative design, because as you said, it's very easy to fall in the trap to use it too often and too on the nose. But I think the best is if you just have a cliche you want to use, like we use the classic noir femme fatale cliche, for example, and we use the cliche for the skeleton of the idea, and then started to move it out of its comfort zone, so to speak. So we added some weird little details that are not part of the actual cliche, and that way it started to branching out to something way more interesting and way more diverse. So I think using cliches is good in some aspects if you use them wisely and use them as just an idea, a skeleton or some base for your idea. Then you start to grow this thing and make it something unique.
As usual, everything is good in moderation, as I think. And we're still waiting for some question, and I have yet another question from me. How did you choose animals for characters? It's pretty interesting because you use so many animals in your game, and how you choose who is who?
Yeah, actually, using animals was more like a world building choice than anything else, because we wanted our characters animals, but yet to be as human as possible. So while they are still animals with obvious animal traits, we use them as these satirical pictures of human human archetypes, basically. And of course, the game and the story plays a lot with this animal nature of the characters, but the important factor are always the errors and faults of the human nature. So this is what we put in the spotlight with the animal-human metaphor we use. And in this regard, Orwell's Animal Farm was even a bigger influence than BoJack Horseman, for example. So we wanted to use the animals the most human way it's possible. But also, yeah, we used some stereotypical things about the animals, like how our two rooster characters are very aggressive and fighty with each other, or something like that. But yeah, overall, the human nature of the animal characters was the most important in this whole metaphor.
Okay, we have some questions from our audience. The first question, could you please give more details or examples of how to introduce a player to the game world in a most natural way?
That's a great question. Well, for this, I think it depends on many things, the genre of the game or something like that. But overall, I think the most important is to put some very common set pieces that you will explain to the player, like, for example, a news article or a poster on the wall, or something that is very common and nothing unusual in it. But if the player see it or inspect it or anything like that, he will get some little pieces about the world. And if you sprawl along the world with these little tiny details and the little tiny things that spoke about the world they are in, I think the player will subconsciously just be a part of the world you created.
Thank you. We have yet another question. What movies, games, or other media inspired you in considering anthropomorphic animals?
Yeah, I think one of my all-time favorites is Porco Rosso from Miyazaki, which movie was a huge influence for me, not just regarding Chicken Police, but overall. Also, in games, I think in games the animal aspect is not so significant in our inspirations. More like the tone and feel of games. Like one of my all-time favorites is Grim Fandango, which was a huge inspiration for us regarding the whole weird aspect of our game, and also the noir aspect of our game. Also games like Snatcher and Police Notes, Kojima's two, I think, very underrated classics. Gameplay-wise, a little bit of LA Noire comes in mind, and getting back to movies and series, I think BoJack Horseman was a late inspiration, because we was in several years of development when BoJack Horseman aired, but it was a mind-blowing experience for us. Also, similar was with Zootropolis, because the game was already in mind when the first trailer arrived, and it was a little bit similar in the core concept. But after I saw the movie, it just strengthened the idea we had that we are in a good path to making this something unique. And also, which is the most obvious, I think, is the old 40s and 50s classic American and British noir movies, which I mentioned in the speech too, like Big Sleep and Gilda, or later Chinatown or something like that. So yeah, overall, everything which is good noir was influenced us, and also some things with great or heavy animal aspect, like Porcros or Orwell's Animal Farm, which I just mentioned. And yeah, that's it.
And yet another question: what are your most favorite games, narrative games, story-driven games?
Wow, that's a very, very, very hard question because I have so many favorites, which I mentioned just now. Grim Fandango is my all-time fav. Also, Ace Attorney series, which I love passionately in this visual novel genre. Also, I like the huge, epic, unreal and branching stories of some JRPGs, like the main titles of the Dragon Quest series or Final Fantasy, for example. Also, the super classic narrative point-and-click adventure games like Full Throttle or the Monkey Island series. Also, I very, very like if a game is not especially a narrative game in its core concept, but uses the narrative aspect in its strength, like the Uncharted series or Last of Us, and also, which is, I think, my most favorite adventure game of all time, besides Grim Fandango, is the Wolf Among Us from Telltale, which I think it's a masterpiece in storytelling, in visual style, basically anything.
Thank you. And yet another question. How has a comic book Blacksad influence on your work?
Actually, I never read Blacksad while I'm working on the game, because here in Hungary it's published very, very late. I think 1 or 2 years ago the Blacksad comics was first published, but I saw some pictures way earlier, so I think subconsciously, sure, it's influenced me and us while we're creating the core concept of the world. But unfortunately, I just came across very late to actually read the comics, and it was awesome. And also, when we were working on the game and they announced the Blacksad game, was a very, very exciting time for us, because we were in the last period of making our game, and this huge noir animal game was announced, and we were like, okay, yeah, but I love the game very well, very much, and the comics as well. So it not was the inspiration in the classical terms, but like a very late inspiration, or just it strengthened us that it's good what we are doing.